And I think we are live. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our second day of the 2022 AML conference. I'm Melissa Leilani Larson, again, president of AML, and we're really excited to have a conversation tonight around the AML 100, which I'm going to turn the time over to our moderator and future AML president, William Morris, to further explain what the AML 100 is and also to introduce our panelists. So as we get going, we've had some really great conversation in the chat from last night's session. So if you have comments or questions, please do share them there, and I will be passing those on to our panel. So take it away, William.
Thanks, Mel. So we are here to talk about the AML 100, and we're excited about this list that we're going to be sharing with you. The list is actually going to go live on the AML blog during our panel here after we talk about it, and we'll post a link to that in the chat as well. I have a few things I want to say by way of introduction, but first I'd love for our panelists to introduce themselves. So if we could start with Kirsta and then go to Mattathias and then Jesse and Michael, and just give us a brief introduction of who you are, and then I'll talk a bit and then we'll get going. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Kirsta Christensen. I am currently on the board of the Association for Mormon Letters. I've been involved or peripherally involved for about 15 years. And in my current position, I'm a librarian, specifically a cataloger at the Harold Bailey Library, Brigham Young University. And I work with our 21st Century Mormonism collection. So basically, anything that you find folks write or produce or write about, I get to catalog. And we have a lot of diverse materials, so I have one of the best accesses to Mormon literature of anyone in the field.
I am Mattathias Westwood, and I've been involved with the Association for Mormon Letters since I was in college, and attended an AML conference and just got drawn into the crowd. I am a former librarian currently, potentially a future librarian as well, but doing other things at this point. And just very excited about religious literature in general and Mormon literature in particular.
I'm Jesse Christensen. I'm not related to Kirsta, although we've been friends for a long time. And I do also work at the Harold Bailey Library at BYU, also in cataloging. I work with Romance language materials, occasionally with Mormon materials, but not very often. But I've also been involved with AML for about 20 years now, since I was an undergraduate at BYU in the English department. I've also been involved with the blog and journal Segula, which is a Mormon women's literary journal, for about 10 years, and I'm currently the editor for that. And I've also been involved with the Whitney Awards for a number of years as well, as a judge and as a voting member of the Whitney Academy. And I really like books, and I really like Mormon literature, especially women's literature, but basically all Mormon literature, especially personal essays and novels. And I'm just really happy to be here tonight.
So, I'm Michael Austin. I once upon a time was an English professor and a functioning and valuable member of society. I am now a useless and overpaid administrator, but at night sometimes I read things and write things, and older Mormon literature is one of my favorite things to read and write about.
Thanks, everybody. If you attended the panel last night, you'll know that this conference, we're dedicating it to Eugene England, who had an amazing impact on many aspects of Mormonism and Mormon studies, but especially on literature. In particular, his essay, Mormon Literature, Progress and Prospects, which first appeared in 1982, and then cropped up in numerous incarnations over the years, with the last version being published in 2001 in Ariantum, basically not only periodized Mormon art, so he set a kind of template of how to think about Mormon literature with various periods, and using terminology that others had used, and then came up with some of his own. And we can talk about whether we agree with that periodization or not. But in addition to that work, what it does is it collects so many titles and authors to look for when it comes to Mormon literature. It is really kind of like the biggest, outside of a few anthologies, the biggest collection of trying to figure out, okay, if you're interested in Mormon literature, who are the people that you should be reading? What are the works that you should be reading? And I know when I found Mormon literature progress and prospects on the Mormon literature website in the late 1990s, it proved invaluable. All I knew about Mormon literature before then was a couple of romance novels that I had read because I had a Sunday school teacher who wrote them, and Orson Scott Card. And so it's a kind of a Herculean effort that he did, and no single one of us has either the time or the attention or the academic remit to repeat that. But quite a few of us at the AML were thinking, we need to do something so that people who are interested in Mormon literature have some entry points. And so we decided to do this list of the AML 100. Now, this is not like Rolling Stone's 100 best albums or the AFI list of best films. This is not a ranked list. We're not saying these are the best Mormon works or even the most important works. What we're saying is that these are works that are significant, that they're notable for some reason related to Mormon literature. And so tonight we have 3 members of the committee who put the list together, Kirsten, Matthias, and Jesse. And then I also invited Michael here. He's also doing a session tomorrow afternoon that's going to be super interesting, I think. But I invited him here because many of you, probably like me, are not like super familiar with early Mormon literature. And I wanted to hear from someone who could kind of make the case for it, why it is worth looking at it if you're interested in Mormon literature. So I'm going to turn the time over to Kirsten to start talking about how we put this list together. Thanks.
Thank you. So one thing when we got together as a committee was that we wanted to have a very clear idea of what we could potentially consider for inclusion and what we were not going to consider. As a librarian and specifically as a cataloger, I think a lot about categories, I think about boundaries, and I think a lot about what it means to include something in a category, what it means to not include something in a category. And we wanted to have very clear understanding of what we were trying to do, not because we were actively trying to exclude certain things, but because we wanted to strengthen the things that we were trying to include. So I sat down and kind of brainstormed. I wrote the first draft of a list of fundamental principles, and went back and forth with other people of the committee and with also members of the presidency. And we talked about things like, we're focusing on readers, so we need these to be things that are available in print. And when it comes to things like drama, there are things that have been performed and things that have won awards that have not been available in print. And again, we're not denigrating things like that, but we wanted to focus on readers and want to focus on things that were available for people. We also wanted to focus on literature or on things that had literary merit. And, again, contrasting with the AML awards, the AML gives awards to academic works, it gives awards to things that are kind of religious and devotional, and we wanted this to be a bit more narrow, to really focus on literature, things that could be read as literature, things that had literary value, although obviously you can have things like essay collections that are in nonfiction. Literature doesn't have to mean solely fiction. We wanted to include a diversity of materials in terms of time period. It is easy to focus on what's only been published in your lifetime. It's easy to focus on things that are really popular. or that have, become really popular over the years. But we didn't have particular quotas that we were trying to hit, but we wanted to make sure that we had materials from lots of different time periods and weren't just biased towards one time period. We also wanted to make sure that we had a diversity of authors and creators of representation. The AML has never been a metric for making sure that people were active or that people had a particular political persuasion. It's always welcome people who've had a diversity of experiences as long as they feel that they have, a connection with Mormonism. And we wanted to be sure to represent that. And then beyond that, we had some really nitpicky questions like, can we include an anthology? If we put an anthology in, is that sneaking in lots of works just so we can kind of pad out the list? Can we include a series of works? What if the series is really long? And so we kind of went back and forth philosophically and decided that we wanted to focus on the impact of a work. And if the work had an impact as a series more than any individual volume in the series, we could include it. And so we do have a few series. And if an anthology had an impact on an anthology level, if we felt that was how it was most important or most notable, then that's how we would include it. And so, in some cases we could have included something as part of an anthology and we chose to include it as a separate work. We did include short stories. So some things have not necessarily been published on their own, but they might be shorter in length. And then some things we included as anthologies or series, even though we could have picked out a single book. And then one of our other big guiding principles was that we did not want the list to be dominated by a single or a handful of authors, even if we really, really, really love those authors. So with very few exceptions, authors are only represented by a single work on the list, even if personally we think that maybe someone's written 5 works that deserve to be on the list. Now, if someone edited a volume, we didn't count that against them. So you will see people who show up as editors multiple times, or if someone co-authored a volume, or if someone appeared in an anthology. But we just wanted to give everyone a starting place with as many authors from as many backgrounds as possible, so that they can kind of move on from there. And we did a lot more hammering out of a lot more details. And it was honestly a really enjoyable process to kind of think through things. We didn't always agree, but I think we were always quite committed to the end goal, which made it a much easier process than others. But that's just an overview of some of our limitations. In terms of genre, we've included novels, some nonfiction, short stories, comics, drama, picture books, and I feel like I'm forgetting one. Did I say, no? Okay, I'm sure there might be one, but there are a lot of different genres. Poetry, thank you. Okay, see, I was thinking plays and I was like, that's the P one. Yes, poetry, thank you. So you'll see all those represented, and I'm really happy with what we ended up with. And certainly there are many, many things that did not end up on the final list that are worthwhile and worth your merit, and hopefully this just serves as a starting point.
Thanks, Kirsta. And now over to Matthias.
Yeah, so a big aim of this list is obviously to get as many people as excited about Mormon literature as possible. And we wanted that to be part of the list creation process, as well as the ongoing reception of the list afterwards. And we also wanted there to be a wide range of input because we were trying to gauge the impact of different works. And obviously, those of us who were on the committee had lots of different backgrounds related to Mormon literature. I think it is worth noting none of the authors of the works on the list were on the committee. No one was nominating their own work in that way. But critics of Mormon literature, librarians, etc. So we decided to have multiple different strategies for getting input from Mormon readers on the list of significant Mormon literature. To do that, we sort of had a 3-prong outreach strategy. Element 1 was a Google survey that we started in January 2021. and sent out across social media, across several blogs, emailed it out to a bunch of people, just asking people to share it and saying, we're requesting interesting Mormon books, right? Books that stood out to you for their literary value. And that ended up receiving several hundred submissions that were unique works. There were also lots of works that got nominated, 10 times, 15 times by different people. And it was really interesting to see the range of those. It definitely had a present bias. The vast majority of works nominated were published within the past 20 years. There was a smattering of classics, but there was a huge range of recent work. There were people who were very clearly going in and submitting, their 30 favorite books or 40 favorite books. There were other people who would just come in and submit one. Some people were, it was clear that some authors had just sent like a mass email to their friends and family list and were like, hey, please nominate my book for this. There were a couple of very obscure self-published works that it was likely the author themselves submitting it. But it was a really wide range of different entries and clearly, showed some energy behind this question of what are your favorite Mormon books? Phase 2 was what we called Mullet Madness. So no relation to any basketball tournaments whatsoever. It just happened to occur during the month of March and be named Mullet Madness. And this was a Twitter competition. I think there was some Facebook involvement as well that had 3 separate stages. We had, first of all, the 5-on-5 competition where we asked people to nominate their, lists of 5 works of Mormon literature to kind of battle against each other, right? You would have a list of 5 and then you would challenge someone else to come up with their list of 5. And so that went around for about a week. And then next was the Mullet Milt Shack or Milt Shake, Milton's and Shakespeare's of our own. We asked people to nominate creators, right, rather than individual works, to say, who's a Mormon author or poet or playwright who's been significant for you. And so people made their arguments for, who are our Miltons and Shakespeare's. And then we ended with Queen of the Bee, which was a set of bracket-like challenges where people would vote in polls for some of the, most significant and well-known Mormon authors and poets, etc., of different periods of time. So we had voting within 5 time period brackets, beginnings period, sort of late 1800s to 1920s period, 1920s to 1960s, and then latter half of the 20th century, and then 2020 to present. And the voting in those was fierce, to the point where we ended up in the semifinals having a exact tie in the vote. So we had to go to a special tiebreaker, but that was just very exciting. It was cool to see the energy around the Mullet Madness. And James Goldberg was telling me that he had seen, like, just last week, someone see the hashtag and finally respond with their 5 novels a year later. So there's clearly some potential energy with that. And part 3 was we compiled a list of people who we thought knew a lot about Mormon literature, both as authors, as academics, other things, people who have been in the AML for a while, and former BYU professors, a pretty wide range of people. I think 60 or 70 different, Mormon literature experts, and asked them, okay, what do you think is the most significant work, and what do you think will possibly be overlooked otherwise? And so we got a whole different set of submissions from those. And that had sort of the reverse effect from the just general public survey, where in that the general public survey was very weighted towards the present, the past 20 years. Obviously, as we were asking a lot of people who are historians or who are academic literary experts in 19th century Mormon literature, the nominations that came in through those inquiries were more heavily weighted towards the past. And so between all three of these, we got a really, really deep pool of titles to then take back to our weighing committee that did the final, closed doors analysis to hammer out of all of these potential titles what would actually end up on the list.
Thanks, Matthias. That was awesome. I did enjoy the Mullet Madness. Jesse is now going to talk a little bit about the scope and composition of the list.
All right. Thank you, Matthias and Kirsta. So once we started getting input from other people, us on the list committee started, trying to sort all this out and figure out how we wanted to do this, how we could kind of wrap our minds around this. And so we needed to come up with kind of working, first of all, really big thanks to Kirsta for making us a nice big chart of all the submissions and, with the authors and year of publication. So that was one of the first things we talked about, was making sure we covered time periods well. As Matthias pointed out, when we got a lot of input, we got a lot of things from the last 20 years and even a lot of things from just the last year or two. And, that got us all thinking. I know it got me thinking a lot about, what is, and at that point we didn't even have a for sure name for the list, something about notable, important. As people have said, we weren't even trying to go for, the best or the ultimate Mormon literature, just things that had an impact. And if you were wanting to get your brain around what Mormon literature is, you could read these works and get a good sense of it. But one thing that we found was it was really easy to get stuff from the most recent years. And it was actually not too hard to think of at least a few things from, the really early days, over 100 years ago. Trying to find stuff in between, maybe not so much. And also we knew that there was more from the early time period. So we had discussions about, do we want to set some quotas of 25% from this time, I'm trying to remember what it was, 1880 to 1910, something along those lines. But then of course you if you give more space to one time period, will you be taking space away from another when more things were published? So that was definitely part of the discussion, was just the overall arc of Mormon literature and the fact that within the last 20 years, a lot more has been published than in previous time periods. There were a lot of things in the early 1900s, late 1800s as well. There certainly were. So we wanted to kind of balance it out. Also, when we're thinking about, this idea of notability, however you want to call it, impact, again, you get that presentism bias. We wanted to make sure we weren't also, not just because more things have been published in the last 10 to 20 years, but also making sure that we weren't just going with that bias of, well, everybody's talking about this book from last year, so it must be impactful, versus everybody's still talking about this book from 100 years ago. So that was one thing we did spend quite a bit of time on, I remember, was trying to work out those parameters. Do we want to set a particular quota of this many things from this time period? I believe we kind of did that, but, we kind of also decided, well, there are a lot of things published post 2000 to now. We did set a cutoff, a bit of a cutoff, that anything published last year, we just decided, even if everybody's talking about it, we weren't going to include it. I can't remember what the very latest publication date was. I think there are one or two things that are within the last 2 or 3 years, but so that was definitely something we considered, talked about, went back and forth on a lot. and making sure we kind of had an even spread over the time period, and making sure we had some stuff from kind of the mid-century, the 1970s and 80s, because sometimes things can get a little forgotten. And when you go back and look at, perhaps, I don't, you go back and look at things written about Mormon literature in the 70s and 80s, who are people talking about a lot, and are we still talking about them? And maybe, I think there were a few things we kind of wanted to put on the list to revive people's interest in them and to get people thinking about them again. Because they influenced some of the stuff we're talking about now. Another thing that Kirsten mentioned was genre. What is literature? Get into the philosophical weeds. As we mentioned, if we're looking at things like AML award winners, sometimes that's even a little broad. We've given, AML has given awards to things that are more history, various types of literature. So another thing we talked about was a lot of the books that got nominated from public input were really more historical, and not necessarily literary, which, as all of us know, can be a little fuzzy. But I think we tried to get a bit more fiction, and there is some essay and memoir on there, and trying to look at different genres like poetry and some of these things that, what genre is this anyway? There's been a few things of, well, do we even know what this is? Doesn't matter. No, that's good. We want it on there, and that's okay. And let's see, diversity of authors as well, because again, over time, who gets published, including languages, including gender, including kind of age or background of the authors, whether they, we really didn't concern ourselves too much with, are they actively LDS or were they at the time or whatever. We kind of went with what's been a common thing within AML for years of, are they writing about Mormons? Are they writing for Mormons? Are they, not necessarily, are they Mormon? I think though, especially when we talk about some authors that have published a lot nationally, I know we talked about, well, if we're picking works, as Kirsten mentioned, we really wanted to have a wide variety of authors on here. Even if one author has written multiple books that we think are noteworthy, we really wanted to leave space to have as many authors included as possible in a wide variety of works. So, if there was a particular author that we wanted that we felt was really emblematic of a particular genre or time period, when we were discussing which work of theirs, we would kind of err on the side of, does this have something to do with Mormonism? Does it engage Mormonism more than some of their other works? Let's see, what are some of the other, also, as I mentioned, genres. I think certain types of genres can be a little tricky. I know poetry, I believe we mostly went for either poetry collections or anthologies of poetry, although there are some individual poems. I believe, did we end up with any individual poems? I don't think we did. I think for poems, I know with short stories, we ended up with a few individual stories.
We have a few individual short stories, but poetry is collections.
Yeah, poetry mostly went with collections, either single authored or a few anthologies, that were edited collections of poetry. Partly for accessibility and just accessibility for people to get them, and as well as I'm not sure if a single poem has been impactful, perhaps, and that's maybe a question for, this list is a living object and we can keep talking about it and we can make other shorter lists and things like that. I'd love to see a list of 10 most impactful Mormon poems. And I do have to say Darlene Young's Boob Job poem needs to be on it because that poem is famous. Let's see. But yeah, I think we did spend a lot of time kind of reflecting as a committee, looking at our list, using the spreadsheet and manipulating it in various ways to just kind of see, okay, we have a lot of things all in this particular category and not enough in another category. Do we have a bunch of things from this particular time period and not that? We looked at female versus male authors because for various time periods, for various reasons, certain people have been published more than others or talked about more than others, depending on their gender. We did specifically as well try to find some things that are in other languages from other countries, which we really want more of that. The process of making the list helped us realize that I hope will be the next 100 notable Mormon books will have, 50% things in other languages from other countries, because this one doesn't have a lot of that. And that's, I think looking at what's not on the list will help us to look at what kinds of literature do we want to seek out and do we want to create and publish and promote in the future. I think that's everything about kind of looking at the list itself and making sure it was balanced, which is not a word I totally love, but comprehensive in a way and inclusive. And hopefully we did our best to try to really broaden our understanding of what authors, what time periods, what types of books are on there, or types of works. They're not all books.
Thanks, Jesse. I wanted to have Michael speak because some of you like me, you might know a little bit of really Mormon literature. You might know like Anna Palm, maybe the poems of Eliza R. Snow, maybe you've read The Giant Joshua, but I knew and suspected that there was a lot of good stuff still out there. And so Michael's going to talk to us about kind of the early Mormon literature in general, and then a specific work in particular. And then we'll move to the next phase of unveiling the list and talking about some of our titles that we like from the list.
All right, thank you, everybody. And as William says, I was not part of putting the list together. It's probably a pretty good thing I was not part of putting the list together, because if I were, there would be almost nothing after 1950 on it. Because that's just my interest. If you kind of look at my bookshelves behind me, everything on those first three shelves was written in the 19th or the first half of the 20th century and is Mormon literature. Because that's what fascinates me. And it fascinates me because my primary interest is in creating the kinds of conditions necessary for there to be a scholarship of Mormon literature, a scholarly tradition that connects to other scholarly traditions of American subcultural literature, of which there are legion: Appalachian literature, Missouri Delta literature, Great Plains literature, Southern literature, African American literature, LGBTQ literature. All of these literatures sort of have emerged as a body of texts that people do scholarship on. And that requires a tradition. I almost always quote Cole Porter when I talk about this. His lyric from the intro to Let's Misbehave: if you want a future, darling, you've got to get a past. Having a tradition is valuable for writers to connect to, but it is absolutely necessary for somebody to create a body of scholarly books, articles that sort of connect with what the rest of the world or what the rest of the country is doing with these kinds of niche subcultural literatures. So most of my work has been what I would call reclamation, going back into the archives, looking for interesting things, looking for books that are not very well known, and trying to use those books to say something interesting about how Mormonism has interacted with America, how it's interacted with other countries, how writers have created spaces within the Mormon culture for certain kinds of discussions and activities and questions. And all of this, it's not that it has to be old. I mean, I'm old and I'm probably telling you all to get off my lawn, and that's okay. But it requires a tradition to speak of. And so in my mind, the older things that are part of the list, and I do thank you very much for including a good number of these earlier works on the list. These are what give us a tradition. These are what give us a coherent and sustained literary tradition that we can now interact with, study, add to, comment on, and critique. So the one book I want to focus on, and it's a book that I've been pushing for about 5 years and trying to get everybody to read, which is probably pretty silly of me, since there are exactly 2 copies right now for sale on the internet. So it's a book, though, that I think is amazingly important, but very few people have heard of. It's called Poplars Across the Moon by Leigh Neville. And I have some slides I want to show to talk about Poplars Across the Moon and why I think it's so important. It's a wonderful book on its own merit, but it's also a wonderful story. So here is Poplars Across the Moon by Leigh Neville. And the most important thing about it is that it's not by Leigh Neville. Leigh Neville does not exist. Leigh Neville is a pseudonym for Lena Horne Richards. And Lena Horne Richards, it was very, very well known in Utah in the 1910s and the 1920s. She was probably the second most well-known, the second most famous writer in Utah or in the Mormon community at that time. And that's a tease. I'll tell you who the first most important one was at the very end. And hint, it's not Vardis Fisher. But she was, here's just some newspaper clippings about her. She was, the governor appointed her to be the famous woman at the Chicago World Fair from Utah. And this is from 1927. She did not hide the fact that she wrote Poplars Across the Moon. She was very open about that. This was not a pseudonym that was trying to protect privacy. It was trying to separate Richard's other work from Poplars Across the Moon. She was a very well-known young adult writer in the 1910s and the 1920s, one of the best known in the country. These are her books. This is kind of her bibliography. She had 3 series of books. Blue Bonnet is a Texas debutante who has wonderful, stunning adventures all over the country. Caroline is a poor young lady who ends up going to college, University of California. This is in the 1920s, becoming a career woman, and really is a kind of a dramatic feminist figure for 1920. And then Henrietta, I have no idea because I have not read those books. I will someday, and I'll tell you all about them. But these books then were our equivalent of the Shannon Hales or the Rosalind Collins Eves, the people who are writing high quality books aimed at young adults, and these specifically at young women. So she's well known in Utah. And then in 1936, oh, forgot to mention, she also publishes in the Young Women's Journal. These are 2 stories of hers, Larry Moran and Safety First, that she publishes in the LDS Young Women's Journal. This is notable because she's not LDS. She moved to Utah, believe it was 1918. Her husband was a doctor. They were Episcopalians. They were never Mormon. But she was published in the Young Women's Journal because she was a well-known writer from the area and felt it was important to publish in the LDS journals at the time. So Poplars Across the Moon. This is written in 1936. This is well after her early career as a writer of young women's fiction. And this is a novel for adults. It is one of my favorite novels about anything. I really think it's a remarkable story. It's the story of a childless couple, Jens and Tula Crusoe, who are second generation Danish Latter-day Saints. And they've never been able to have children. And then towards the end of their life, towards their 50s, because life is over when you're 50. But towards the end of their life, they adopt 2 young girls. One is 5 and one is just an infant. Their mother was a Danish woman who eloped from Denmark with a charming missionary. That missionary abandoned them. The mother died. They didn't know what to do with the girls. They knew that Jens and Tula were Danish. They're popular members of the community. And so they adopt these girls, Christina and Karen, who then the novel becomes the story of their lives and of Jens and Tula, and really of Tula. Jens is the sort of stoic, solid, works a lot, doesn't say much, Danish Mormon father. Tula is a loving, wonderful woman who gives everything to these 2 girls that she adopted. She considers them miracle children. And all that she asks of them really is that they remain in the faith that she loves so much. They are very committed Latter-day Saints. and she wants her daughters to be so as well. Christina, the older daughter, doesn't take to the church. By the time she's 12 years old, she is sneaking around and attending Episcopalian churches. And she ends up moving to Salt Lake, working for the governor at the time. She is baptized as an Episcopalian, marries in the Episcopalian church, has what we would now call a faith transition. And this devastates Tula, who doesn't think she can live with the fact that one of her precious daughters has rejected the faith that she loves. And this causes the main conflict of the novel as she undergoes this faith transition. And the novel is a very close-knit, very supportive, loving LDS family that is thrown into turmoil by one of the children leaving the church. That sound familiar to anybody? I hope so, because this is something that is still a major issue today. So when we read Poplars Across the Moon, what we see is an early entry in a very, very common theme in LDS literature, and that is the dual nature of close communities and close families. It provides love and support, but it provides duty and obligation, and it interferes with children forming their own identities. And you see this in Terry Tempest Williams' Refuge. You see this in Orson Scott Card's Songmaster. You see this in most of the novels of Virginia Sorensen. You see this in much of the work of Phyllis Barber. It's this idea that within Mormonism, the community is so close-knit and the family is so close-knit, and that's wonderful, but it also can be terrible because it imposes these duties and a sense of obligation that can tear a family apart. So here we have a very early novel of a non-Mormon writer who has been living with the saints for many years and has become really very, very well known within the Latter-day Saint community. And she tells this story, and we can learn from this. One thing we can learn is that the problems we think are big problems for millennials today have been problems for a very long time. But it also tells us a story about how during the 1930s, Mormonism became a cultural force that both Mormons and non-Mormons in the Mormon cultural region came together and really created a culture. I told you that she's the second most important writer in Utah in the 1920s. The most important writer in Utah in the 1920s was Frank Chester Robertson, who wrote over 100 hardback westerns. He was along with Zane Grey and a few others, was one of the most popular western genre writers. And 1 year before Poplars Across the Moon, he wrote a novel, also under a pseudonym, called The Rocky Road to Jericho, which is 4 years before Children of God, an attempt to deal with Mormon history and the Mormon migration. Those two became, one was a Mormon who had kind of drifted away from the church. The other was a non-Mormon who was very sympathetic to the church. They were both very, very well-known writers before they ever wrote a word about Mormonism. And they both used that platform to create really compelling and important fiction that tends to get lost in the cracks because nobody pays attention to the 1930s. The Lost Generation begins with Vardis Fisher writing Children of God in 1939. It goes through the 40s and the 50s. The home literature generation really ends when Nephi Anderson stops writing in the 1920s. So the 1930s are really an orphan period of Mormon literature, but this is the time when the Mormon cultural region, both Mormons and non-Mormons alike, coalesced into a coherent body of cultural production that includes some remarkable literature. We can learn a lot, and I mentioned two of them. I could pull out 50 books right now from the 1910s, 20s, and 30s that have similar stories. But look at what's happening. These are the places I go when I want to find books. This is the WorldCat entry for Poplars Across the Moon. There are 14 copies of it in libraries around the world. ABE Books and Amazon have no copies available. There are 2 copies on eBay. I want all of you to go buy this, but only 2 of you are going to be able to. The first one is going to pay $42.57 on eBay, and the second one is going to pay $250 on eBay. And then there will be no copies for sale anywhere in the United States that is represented on the internet. So, and these don't become public domain for another 10 or 15 years. Katja can tell us more about when that happens, but what, 15 years? So you can't get this on Google Books. You can't get it on Project Gutenberg for 15 years. There are very few copies in libraries. This is the work of the critic. This is the work of the scholar, both reading these books and writing about them, but then researching the copyright, finding who owns these rights and republishing them, which is also something I plan to do with Poplars Across the Moon through BCC Press. And that's a project of love, but we can't have these books if we don't preserve them. So that's kind of my spiel here. I am very grateful to the AML and to this list because that will single out some of these works, and it will cause people, I think, to start preserving them before we lose them. And I can't think of a more important thing I would rather do for the rest of my academic, non-administrative, scholarly life than preserve this tradition and deliver it up to the next generation so that they can use it to build on. The end.
Thanks, Michael. Really appreciate that perspective. So the AML website is, I had had it all queued up, and it is timed out and dying on me. So the list is not live yet. I will try to get to it as soon as I can. Hopefully I can load it. Andrew Hall might be listening. Andrew, if you can get into WordPress and make it live, that would be great. But we're going to proceed with how we were always going to proceed, which is if we could go back in the same order that we did the panel. And I've asked each of the panelists to have a couple selections at the ready of books that they just want to talk briefly about from the list. So we'll start with Kirsta and go around the horn.
Thank you. Very briefly, something that we've danced around a little bit, but maybe not said expressly, is that we do want this to be a living list and something that inspires a lot of other lists. So we have hopes and plans to revisit this list on a regular basis. So materials that didn't make our 2020 cutoff will, certainly be available to be reevaluated. And we also really hope that members of the community, whether they are, official AML members or people who are new or just interested, also contribute lists that we would love to publish and publicize. We've included a few poetry books on the list. Can you make a list of 20 poetry books or 20 fantasy authors or 20 books from the 1930s that we've ignored? And can we get, even really specific, and what are the top 3 graphic novels about missionaries? Because there are that many. So we would love to see that, and also use the full list and any shorter list that people come up with, and make postcards and flyers and cover the earth like a Rolling Stone to promote the list. So that's something that I just wanted to make clear. So I wanted to start off, we each gave kind of some ideas of different works that we wanted to talk about. I wanted to start out by talking about the graphic novel Dendo. It is a novel that I'm pretty sure won the AML award a few years ago. And it's a graphic novel about an LDS missionary, sister missionary, serving her mission in Tokyo, Japan. Dendo is a Japanese word that's related to missionary work, but it's actually a diary. And as I recall, Brittany Long Olson, so at the time Brittany Long, was an illustration major at I think SUU, and she had been toying around with the idea of keeping a diary in the form of a graphic novel, so with panels and comics and doing a page a day or a spread a day. And so when she also decided to go on a mission, and when she got her call, she decided that she would keep a missionary diary as a graphic novel. And every day, in addition to a more standard missionary diary, every day she wrote a few panels about what had happened that day. came home and redrew all the comics and redrew everything, kind of took her original diary as sort of a rough draft, shopped it around to a few LDS publishers, didn't really get any takers. So she ended up self-publishing it through print-on-demand technology. And it's wonderful. I can see why it didn't fit in with some of the standard publishing models of the bigger LDS publishers, but it's wonderful. It's wonderful, it's lovely. And people I know, I didn't serve a mission myself, but everyone I know who did serve a mission talks about, if you did serve in Japan or Southeast Asia, it really resonates with you. But even if you didn't, it's just so true to missionary life. One of the things that I think is particularly special about it, there are lots and lots of mission stories in LDS literature, both memoirs on the nonfiction and on the fiction end. And if you're someone who likes or proposes like the hero's journey, mission stories fit perfectly into that, down to a literal call. So there is like a reason that we tell these stories. But one of the things that I really love about Dendo is that she did a page or a spread for every single day. And often when we are retelling stories, we hit the highs and we hit the lows, and it kind of sounds like, or we smooth out some of the rough areas so that things seem like they have more of a purpose or they have more of a climax. Frankly, there are a lot of days that are boring and frustrating, and people are hot, she's hot and sticky and no one wants to talk to her. And I think that in that sense, it's a much more realistic portrayal of mission life than a lot of previous works have been. It's a wonderful volume, and like I said, I didn't serve a mission, and I still really loved it and really identified with it. So I don't think that's a prerequisite. I also, frankly, think it's maybe one of the better introductions if someone is high school age and wondering about serving a mission. It honestly, I think, is a better representation than a lot of other fiction. And I'll just say, it's really unfortunate that we're having website issues right now, but because I'm seeing the chat replayed, I kind of feel like I'm at the Oscars or something, because we're announcing some of these live. So this is very exciting. That's a dream I didn't know I had, and now it's come true.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the doubles. We do have a small number of authors who are on here twice individually. Like we said, there are a few people who have edited multiple volumes, including Eugene England, who are on as editor, as contributor to multiple anthologies. But there are a handful of people who are on the list twice as the primary contributor with at least 2 works. Well, no one more than 2. And I want to talk about those and how those people got on twice, because I think it is sort of like the EGOT for Mormon Letters is having multiple works on the AML 100, because in all but one case, it indicates that this is an author who's outstanding in sort of multiple different forms in a way that was so significant that we had to pay attention to it. The first is Carolyn Pearson, who's on the list first with her very significant poetry collection, her first poetry collection. It sort of created a space for Mormon women's poetry. When it came out, was massively popular, sort of really hit a nerve at the time. And then also with her memoir, Goodbye, I Love You, which is her memoir about her marriage and divorce and ongoing close relationship with a gay man, and how that affected her life, and developed great reserves of compassion and a way of understanding things that isn't necessarily the traditional straightforward Mormon understanding. but that I think has been deeply influential for Mormon community. And those are both, absolutely significant and powerful books in their own right, but are, early poetry collection and then a memoir looking back upon decades of these experiences. Second is Margaret Blair Young, who is on the list as a co-author with Darius Gray for their Standing on the Promises series, which is a historical fiction series following early African-American members of the church, and is quite possibly the reason that Jane Manning James has become a sort of household name for Latter-day Saints generally, because they did the work of digging up a lot of the primary sources, and in fact updated the series, re-released the series several times to account for newly found historical research. And that brought people back into the narrative of LDS history who had been left out of the story for a long time. And to the point now where people who Darius and Margaret wrote about are now in sort of the standard LDS curriculum. So, they've sort of come full circle. And then also for her novel Salvador, which is sort of unusual. It's an excellent novel. It falls into the general realm of what Eugene England called faithful Mormon realism. But most faithful Mormon realism, realism is a very important word to its definition, right? There aren't really mystical experiences, or everything is sort of on a communal level, but without miraculous events intervening. And Salvador, which is the story of a LDS divorced woman sort of experiencing some changes in her life as she also takes a visit to family in Central America, is a Mormonism that's got some more of the miraculous and numinous elements present in the lives of individuals, which is very much a part of lived Mormon experience, and especially the founding events of Mormonism, but often was absent from that period of literature. And she sort of made sure that stayed in view. It's definitely worth checking out. Third is Eric Samuelson. He's on the list twice in the drama category, right? He, unlike the others I'm talking about who excelled in two different realms, he's just so significant to the history of Mormon drama that we felt like we had to include two separate works of his that were doing very different things stylistically. Gadianton, which is about present, contemporary Utah, roughly 90s, early 2000s. And it's sort of about how business relationships and the setting of a corporation that was founded locally that's now being sold off, and how that affects people's lives, impacts people's communal and religious commitments to each other, and the interplay those have, with, as the title suggests, some fairly heavy overtones. And then The Plan, which is a series of scenes about women in the Old Testament and the pre-existence, that are sort of debates about, what are we doing here? What's our role as humans, and how do we deal with these different sorts of trauma and suffering that we experience? Really interesting sort of commentary on scripture and on theology played out in drama. And so we felt like those were both significant enough in the history of LDS drama that they needed to be included. And then James Goldberg is in the list with his novel, The 5 Books of Jesus, I guess his most Mormon novel. He has multiple novels. And then also his work with popular historian Artis Partial, who's done a lot of archival work on overlooked people in Mormon history, and kind of digging into people's lives and finding people who aren't otherwise known. They work together on a collection of poetry about different Mormons in different places around the world throughout Mormon history. And it gives sort of a more global perspective on LDS history and a more ground level view rather than just focusing on apostles and missionaries and leaders than any other either historical or literary work on Mormonism. And it's just a really, really powerful collection. So we felt like both that poetry collection and that novel deserve recognition on the list, and have proved significant in the way that they're impacting the literary tradition. So those are the ones that I wanted to just quickly address. Why did we end up having a few exceptions to our one book per person rule?
Okay, thank you, Matthias. I think that was great. So I picked a few things. It's interesting because they said, think of some stuff that people aren't talking about, and sometimes that's so hard to tell. So one of the books I picked that I wanted to talk about, that I hope to have a visual aid, but I don't, but I actually have the Ariantum from 2003 with Anita Stansfield on the cover. This is a special issue about romance. This is excellent. This is a great issue all about romance books. And the book I wanted to talk about was Anita Stansfield's First Love, Second Chances, which was published in 1995. And it was published by Covenant. It's actually the second book in a series of romance books. I think there were 3 total about this woman, Emily. And the first book, First Love and Forever, came out the year before that. But I think First Love, Second Chances just, the first book was kind of setting up the story. The second book was really, so this woman, Emily, she had done the right thing and married. She had this hot Australian boyfriend, but he wasn't a member. And so she married the right guy and had children and was living the good Mormon life. And then the non-member ex-boyfriend appeared in her life again in the first book. And she was really torn between, do I keep my covenants? Do I stay with my husband? And she makes that choice, and then her husband dies. So in the second book, the Australian Michael has converted to the church, and she's now a widow and dealing with adjusting to widowhood, having small children, trying to decide, well, now that barrier is not there, now maybe I can marry this guy because now he's a member. And, as a romance book, it has a happy ending, but, we wanted to have something by Anita Stansfield on the list because she was, if you look at the current market for fiction in places like Deseret Book, if you look at who is writing and self-publishing books, there is a lot of romance fiction out there for LDS women, about LDS women, written by LDS women without LDS content, historical content. Romance and women's fiction, that's a big and long, complicated issue. There's been, on the national scene, there's a lot of conversations about, women's fiction that's written by women that deals with issues important to women, such as love, romance, family. I mean, obviously those things should be important to men, but there's kind of this genre of that. And Anita Stansfield in the 90s was one of the first ones to really start publishing these books for Mormon women to, it's kind of the Bridges of Madison County, but clean, and looking at Mormon issues of temple marriage, of family, of covenants, of, I feel like another thing, all those things that Michael actually was talking about, that were issues of fiction in the 30s with Poplars Across the Moon. It's the same issues, those same concerns that Mormons have. And when you read stories in the Ensign about, or in the New Era of, you made the right choice, you married the right person in the temple, and then what? So Anita Stansfield and a lot of similar authors, in this thing of Ariantum, there's Josie Kilpack, Rachel Nunes, Sierra St. James, Annette Lyon, women who are still writing those kinds of books. I think another really important thing Anita Stansfield was doing at that time period in the 90s was there was a lot of fiction published in the New Era, as well as in books like by Jack Wayland. I'm trying to think else, Alma Yates, that were for teenagers and really focused on the romance of Now you can date in high school or college. How do you find the right person? How do you get together with them? Books like Charlie by Jack Wayland, which we have on the list as well. But what Anita Stansfield and some of these other women were doing was, okay, what happens after what happens for adult women? How do you manage those questions in your life? And I think that, as we're talking about this list as books that were significant and for understanding where Mormon literature is coming from. Again, as Michael pointed out, what is our history? And those authors in those romance books, you've got the stuff in the 80s of Jack Wayland, Punch and Cookies Forever, Charlie, all these stories. I grew up reading those stories in the new era of, I'm going to go to BYU, and at 19, I'm going to go to a dance and meet some guy, and we're going to get married, and it'll be amazing. And so you had those stories, and then you get going on to women like Anita Stansfield and Rachel Nunes publishing stuff for women, by women, about women. And now we can see so many other really wonderful authors that are continuing to publish historical romance, contemporary romance, authors like Melanie Jacobson, who are publishing kind of chick lit about contemporary educated career Mormon women who have those questions about who should I marry? Should I get married in the temple? What happens when there's obstacles in the way? How do you know if someone's the right person? So that's why Anita Stansfield is on the list. And because I think that romance fiction is really an important part of Mormon literature that sometimes I don't think we talk about enough. And particularly it's been an important part of Mormon literature for at least 30 years now. And she was and is really one of the most important figures in that genre.
Okay, so am I up?
You're up.
Okay. So I want to talk about some old stuff. No surprise. And specifically, I want to talk about Elias by Orson F. Whitney. And that is, this is the 1914 edition. This is the 1904 edition. Apparently the 1904 edition is what made the list. But I want to talk about the 1914 edition, because this is, to my knowledge, one of only 2 sustained works of literature by sitting apostles. The other one is Mark E. Peterson's dating novel For Time and All Eternity, which I do not recommend that anybody read. Elias, however, I do recommend that people read. And Whitney is probably most famous for his line about Milton's and Shakespeare's of our own. He was really was one of the driving forces of home literature until he was called as an apostle in, I believe it was 1905, right after his first edition of Elias. He put his money where his mouth was, or at least he put his talent where his interests were in Elias, which is something that was very odd in the early 20th century, and that is an epic poem. And epic poems were not a big deal in 1904. They were a big deal in 1604. But he wrote this, and I want to do just one little one slide to talk about what makes Elias so wonderfully weird. Is that it's a 10-canto poem, and each canto is written in a completely different poetic style, poetic form that mimics a major epic. So Canto 1 is written in blank verse that is very similar to Wordsworth's The Prelude. Canto 2 is written in Spenserian stanzas, which is A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, series of lines, of iambic lines with an Alexandrine or a 12-syllable line at the end. Canto 3 is in ballad stanzas. It sounds like Coleridge's Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Cantos 4 and 5 imitate Milton's blank verse in Paradise Lost and then in Paradise Regained. Canto 6 is Spenserian stanzas again. Canto 7, closed heroic couplets, a very strange form that was really mainly popular in the 18th century in Britain. And this really imitates Pope's essay on man. Canto 8, more blank verse. Canto 9, closed heroic couplets again. Canto 10, more blank verse. So when you read this poem, what you have is a writer who is very well read, but also self-taught. You know, Whitney has lived in Utah all of his life. He's Mormon royalty. I mean, his grandparents are Newell K. Whitney and Heber C. Kimball, so he's extremely well connected. He has been reading this literature alone. He has not had a way to formalize his education. So he comes to this question of how to present Mormonism to the world, and he takes pieces from the best known epics and major poems of his own reading. So Spenser's Faerie Queene, Milton's Paradise Lost, Wordsworth's Prelude, Pope's Essay on Man, and Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And he mimics all of these in Elias. And what he does, Elias, this is a story of the Restoration. This is a story of the sacred history of the world according to Mormonism. Elias is the figure who comes to the author and tells him this story. It also turns out that that Whitney thought he was the reincarnation of Elias. He believed in multiple mortal probation, so he actually honestly believed that he was the biblical Elias, reincarnated to tell this story. This is a fascinating work of early Mormon literature, and you will also be seeing a critical edition of this from BCC Press fairly soon.
Thanks, Michael. So that answers your question, Joa. There will be a critical edition of Elias. Poplars Across the Moon. Somebody had asked about BCC Press doing that, because I think you'd mentioned it, Michael, but it's, you'd have to get the rights for it, right?
I'm researching copyrights right now to see if we can do that. If we can, we will.
Awesome. So there was a question from Eric Jepson, who says he would love to hear about some of the more agonizing decisions. You know, maybe if we don't want to, the committee doesn't specifically want to mention people who are left off, some of the titles that aren't from a writer who made the list, but you know, what were some of the agonizing decisions? Anybody want to take that one?
I think we may want to keep agony hidden in the closed chambers.
I think I can say something very broad and non-specific. So I think some of the more agonizing decisions were which work by a given author. We were often very unified about, like, this person needs to be on the list, but then figuring out which one. And then for some authors, it was, do we do their most well-known work versus do we do their most Mormon work? Or do we do a work that one of us particularly loves and wants to champion, but, you know, the other ones don't feel as strongly about. And, you know, we went back and forth a little bit with the presidency about the list to kind of talk about, you know, missed areas and stuff. And there were some times when the presidency was like, no, you don't get to do this super obscure work by this person. You need to do the work that everyone loves and won all the awards. We're like, okay, fine. But then there were times that they came back and they were like, oh no, you know, we want you to do this. We want you to do this really obscure work by this person. And I'm like, we know you love it, but that's not the one that everyone's talking about. So, so I will say those were some of our more agonizing lists. And I also, you know, if we had gone up to 110 or 120, I do have some ideas about who we probably would have included on that. But yeah, I think it was often that we all agreed that an author should be on the list, and then just figuring out which one. We also had an issue where, and now I'm forgetting which author it was specifically, but they had work that was published. They had a collection of work that was published that's now in the public domain, but then they had a critical edition that was published later that was not in the public domain. And so we had a debate about do we go for the thing that is openly available to everyone, the thing that we could actually reprint an edition of if we wanted to because it's in the public domain, or do we go to the thing where probably you'd have to go to an academic library to get it? But it has those notes and is probably a better representation of that. So those were some of the debates that we had, again, without getting specific about specific authors and works.
I will say, I think it's fairly safe to say, we're avoiding discussing specific authors just in case any of those authors are listening, because we know that authors of Mormon literature are among the biggest fans of Mormon literature. But there was heated debate over whether the Book of Mormon counted as literature for purpose of the list. You'll note that it's not on the list, but that was fairly contentious and long-lasting discussion among the committee, because it was nominated frequently in the public nominations, and it is, it's a story. It's a pretty exciting story, but in the end, we figured that there were 100 other excellent Mormon books as well, so we did not include the text of Mormon literature, the Book of Mormon.
Yes, we did have multiple lively debates. One thing that I keep thinking about with this list is a saying that applies to libraries, which is that every good library will have something that will offend somebody. And, maybe offend is not the right word, but I'm hoping there's nobody who completely agrees with everything on this list and this is their perfect, wonderful list. Like we said, we want to have some conversations about the list. List is a starting place. I know, speaking for myself, and I'm presuming to speak a bit for people on the committee, everybody has something on this list that was like, I don't know if I wanted that on the list. But again, we're trying to find notable things. We're trying to promote a wide variety of Mormon literature and to talk about Mormonness and how it could be expressed. And so we were hoping to get a variety of things. And yes, when you're working within particular parameters, especially like I said, when we're trying to get a good variety of genres and time periods and things, some people got left out and some books got left out that maybe we wanted them to be on there. Maybe we didn't. I don't know, but maybe you wanted them to be there. And if you did, I'm sorry. Like we said, let's make our own more specific list. That would be amazing.
And another little peek behind the scenes, I think it was 2 days ago, William emailed me kind of in a panic to say, I only have 99 books. And I counted, and there were only 99. And it was on a spreadsheet. And so the top line was like title, date, publisher, and then there were 99 rows, the 100 rows, but they're not 100 books. And I went into a bit of a panic, thinking maybe we had always been one short, maybe, and then things were in multiple places. And so for a little while, as I was counting to 100 or to 99 over and over again, trying to find this thing, we did eventually figure out that there was a late edition that I had simply forgotten to send him on the very last book. But for a while, I had visions of 99 books. And the 100th book is the friends we made along the way, or the 100th book is you, or the 100th book you get to decide. I'm trying to spin this potential oversight into something meaningful, and then we found the 100th book, so we don't have to be all cheesy or add the Book of Mormon in at the last minute.
So the 101st book is the friends.
Yes.
That's right. Yes, I was very happy about that. So I'm going to say three things, and we have one more question I want us to get to because we are getting close to our end of our time. The first I'm going to say in my official capacity as Vice President for the Association for Mormon Letters. We did have a little bit of involvement in the list at the very end. There are a few titles that we strongly suggested. There are a few things that we reacted to, and we in the community came to compromise. But the bulk of the titles on the list are the ones that came to us from through that process and from the committee. Part of the reason for that is because we wanted to respect the integrity of the committee. Many of the members of the committee are anonymous. I don't know who the other members of the committee are. Part of the reason we did that is because we're at this place with the leadership and Association for Mormon Letters where Andrew Hall, our awards coordinator, has edited several works of Mormon literature, and our past president, current president, so James Goldberg, Melissa Leigh-Larson, and myself are all creative writers. And in an ideal world, we would have a presidency that was maybe all critics or all readers, but and so that we, I think, to speak for James and Mel, I think we'd all be happy to just kind of step back and just write our stuff, but that's not where we're at. And so, so that was part of the process. But speaking not in my official AML capacity, and just kind of my own reaction as I was looking at the list, to me, two of the more difficult things to think was like, okay, which Orson Scott Card and which Steve Peck? And so as the members of the committee have been saying, we welcome you to make your own lists. We will be doing more things with this list. All of the titles on this list will be receiving blurbs from various folks in the community. I've already gotten a bunch of them in, and they're really, really well written. I am very pleased how this is going. And so that will be coming out this fall, and we'll be continuing to do posts and other things about this list. And what we're also hoping is that, actually, I don't know if I can speak for the committee on this. We're hoping this will be a continual process that the AML undertakes every so often. Is that?
Yeah, our proposal to the presidency was every 5 years that the list gets reviewed, and a new version with, what's been published in that time gets presented.
So this is an exciting process. Okay, Ian had an interesting question. And so I'd like to throw this to everybody, including Michael. There was some discussion about this in the Eugene England panel last night. He says, at the end of this process, how do you feel about Gene England's claim that the personal essay is the ultimate genre or form for Mormon writing?
I think that's a very compelling statement from a personal essayist.
I agree. I think that reflects a certain bias that Gene had. I would probably say the novel because that's my bias.
Whereas I would say the play because it's the most communal, right? But again, I was a theater kid.
I love personal essay. That's really how I got into Mormon literature, partly because I'm a little voyeuristic and I like to know what people are thinking. And, personal essays, you're like, here, let me tell you all my angst in a beautiful, well-written format. But, I'm going to give the answer I always give where I don't really have a lot of favorites. I think all the different genres have different strengths, and I think we need them all. That's also a very librarian answer of like, there's a book for every purpose and books for everybody and forms of work. And I also think that there are new things like Kirsten was talking about Dendo. I love Eugene England, but I don't know if he ever envisioned a memoir about a mission written by a sister missionary in graphic form, or things like Monsters and Mormons or, Future Day Saints, some of these really experimental type of things, or even a book like A Song of Names, which is a poetry book, but also has illustrations and also has little historical vignettes, explanations. I think that there are many kinds of genres. I hesitate to say there is an ultimate genre. I think that there are many stories on earth and many people and many experiences, and therefore they can all be told and shared in different ways to meet different people's needs. And to, I also like surprises. I feel like we can learn things from the unexpected and from new juxtapositions. And maybe I'm just a postmodernist, but I like being open to having lots of possibilities. But personal essay is great. I do love personal essays. I think we need more of them. I think maybe they're falling out of favor a little, but yes, they're ultimate, but so is everything else. That's my non-answer. Everybody's special.
I will say, not to reawaken the Book of Mormon as literature debate, but we all know that the true Mormon literary form is the 1,000-year-long multi-author chronicle of a doomed people.
And that reminds me of Matthias. Another thing that is yet to be done is because we decided to, for the most part, well, no, actually not for the most part. We don't have criticism on this list, and that's another thing that we need to focus on as a community interested in Mormon literature is there's a lot of lost criticism out there, for sure. And there's a lot of criticism that needs to be written. I want to thank the panelists not only for appearing on this panel, but for all the work that you did, Kirsta and Matthias and Jesse on the AML 100 list, and Michael on your work with BCC Press. Because speaking as someone who is a writer and hopes to create, however small and minor, some sort of legacy, and who also has benefited greatly in terms of having Mormon literature, previous works of Mormon literature inform my own work, I greatly value this type of work. It's totally needed. So applause and kudos. Anybody want to have any final comments? Any additional works you want to throw out? I think we're ready to wrap up here.
Well, I would like to add to your thanks to us. Thanks to all the people who were involved in the committee process, in these deliberations, in proposing ideas for the list, and to all of the people who nominated stuff or shared all of those Molit Madness posts on social media. This has just been a very exciting process that wouldn't have come together without a lot of people being very enthusiastic about Mormon literature. And I think the end result is very encouraging to anyone who wonders, is there a literature worth caring about from our community? Yes, there totally is. We could have done a much longer list with more works. It's not like we ran out of works that were significant or interesting or valuable. We just had to figure out what's a representative sample of all the good stuff out there. And I think if you go and dig into this list, you'll find something to convince you that Mormonism has a literature worth caring about.
Thanks, Matthias. Anybody else want to say something? Are we good? Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. The conference continues tomorrow with a whole bunch of panels, including conversations with our special award winners, Michael Austin and Darling Young, tomorrow afternoon. There'll be some awesome papers presented tomorrow morning. And then in the evening, there will be the awards and some readings by our award winners. So tune in. All right, thanks everybody. See ya.